In June 1989, the image of a lone figure halting a battalion of tanks in the Chinese capital of Beijing sent shockwaves across the world. But it is an image which China itself prefers to forget. 24 hours earlier, the city had witnessed a scene of unimaginable horror. The People's Army had taken control of Tiananmen Square and were poised to kill.
I will never forget the scene there. The spectacle of a full army invading its own capital is almost unprecedented in human history.
What had started as a peaceful student protest calling for liberty ended 7 weeks later in carnage.
We challenged the government before everybody in the whole world. And they took the worst of all options.
A bloody and brutal climax to what had become a battle for the very soul of a nation.
I never thought we got so close to shape an entirely different future for China. And I never expected the military crackdown was so extreme. How could this happen? Why did this happen?
30 years on, eyewitness reflections and secret documents give us a fresher and deeper understanding of how this massacre at Tiananmen changed the course of Chinese history. Nowhere in the world is so much power concentrated in one place, Tiananmen Square. Every decision affecting the lives of 1.5 billion Chinese citizens is decided here by the will of the permanently ruling Chinese Communist Party. But Tiananmen is more than just a representation of absolute power. Tiananmen is the beating heart of China, built by the people, for the people, the very embodiment of the soul of the Chinese nation, and a symbol of its history and tradition. But for 7 dramatic weeks in 1989, it also became a battleground to determine nothing other than the people's future. For over the course of the 1980s, China had been undergoing a radical transformation. From a previously closed society to one that was embracing modernity, individuality, the good life. The Communist Party had opened up to Western values and influence.
The 1980s will be remembered as the best decade in contemporary Chinese history. It was a moment of really high expectation, rising expectation, and happiness.
Taking credit for this golden age was the country's recently installed paramount leader, Deng Xiaoping. A long-standing party official persecuted during Mao's Cultural Revolution. By the start of the 1980s, Deng envisioned a new deal for China. He promoted a program of economic reform dubbed the Four Modernizations, promising a better standard of living for every Chinese citizen. But alongside this newfound prosperity was the looming shadow of a fifth modernization, the people's voice, democracy. And in an unelected single-party state, this presented Deng with a dilemma. Would he dare to make that final move?
Deng Xiaoping joue l'équilibre. Quand il voit que ces réformes sont menacées, il relance l'ouverture aussi bien dans le domaine économique que dans le domaine politique. Mais lorsqu'il voit que la société menace de remettre en question la dictature du parti, dans ces conditions, il resserre les vis, car pour lui, seule la direction du parti permettra de moderniser la Chine.
Throughout the 1980s, the party's repressive dictatorship had been increasingly under question. Late in 1986, a student protest arose in Beijing that was swiftly curtailed. But it had found support within the party from its leading modernizer, General Secretary Hu Yubang. On April 15, 1989, his sudden, unexpected death sparked a call for reform that would not be so easily curtailed.
The year of 1989 is a year that is ready for evaporation. It's like for explosion. I would describe the campus as more like a cake of gunpowders and ready for any spark to drop. And then Hu Yaobang's death served as that.
Thousands of Beijing students headed for Tiananmen Square to honor this people's champion. For in return for standing up for a better society in China, he'd been harshly dismissed from the party. His courage would not be forgotten.
胡耀邦本人是中国共产党里面算是比较开明的一个领导人，所以我们做学生的其实心里是对他有一份亏欠，觉得对不起他，那么他的去世对我们来讲情感上冲击力度更大一点。
As thousands mourned in the square, little did they realize that Hu Yubang's legacy would be huge, to set in motion the biggest pro-democracy movement China had ever seen.
所以我真的也是向他表示哀悼。但是在广场上，我看到很多同学他们的演讲中国要民主、要自由、要改变。 我是以为春游才去参加那场运动，但是在那个过程当中让我成长了。
在这里谈到了民主，民就是人民大众，主就是当家作主。我们要当家作主。
Freedom of speech, a free press, a more transparent government. These would be the rallying cries of demonstrations of hope in the weeks that followed. But how far was the Communist Party ready for a complete political turnaround? By 1989, Deng Xiaoping had stepped down from day-to-day leadership of the party, but as calls for reform escalated into a national crisis, he would continue to pull the strings. Central to his political maneuverings would be the playoff between his two opposing successors. Cautious, hardline conservative premier Li Peng and the party's more moderate reformist General Secretary Zhao Ziyang.
开始赵紫阳是一直管经济的，他告诉我不要管政治方面的事情，但是到了87年的9月，邓小平告诉赵紫阳，你要提出一个中国政治改革的一个总体方案出来，这样呢，就是中央成立了一个领导小组，这个办事机构呢，赵紫阳就提名由我负责。
But Zhao's task was never going to be straightforward. He faced heavy resistance from within. For the one thing that hadn't modernized in the 80s was the Communist Party itself. Every facet of society was still closely monitored and controlled so that order and stability could be maintained. The party is normally a byword for secrecy, but thanks to thousands of official documents later leaked from China, now known as the Tiananmen Papers, the little-known inside story of the path to Tiananmen's brutal crackdown can now be uncovered.
April 17th afternoon, Politburo meeting. Party Secretary Zhao Ziyang and Premier Li Peng are notified that there are worrisome trends on university campuses. Zhao asserts his view that the student protests are essentially patriotic, but that reason should be their watchword. Li Peng, however, argues that the problems should be nipped in the bud. He has been warned that anti-communist ideas of bourgeois liberalization are in the air and must be blocked.
Within just a week, the students had mobilized into a movement brimming with confidence. As the most elite sector of Chinese society, they saw themselves as the guardians of China's future, fired up to challenge the authoritarian nature of the communist regime. On the walls of Beijing's universities, giant handwritten posters, known as Dazibao, promoted their mandate for democratic reform. Leading the way was a 21-year-old veteran of political campaigning, soon to be the movement's principal strategist, Wang Dan.
学生的目的主要是给政府压力，让政府是推进民主化，但是政府或者说政府内的保守派理解错了。 他把他们理解为说，学生是要推翻政府，是要让他们下台。基于这个错误的判断，他们才去进行这种镇压。
It was never considered as a revolution. The government was never the target to be toppled. The protesters, me included, wanted the government to recognize us as a part of the national politics.
We never wanted to overthrow the regime. We wanted the government to reform as they have promised. That's why the main slogan of 1989 student movement was dialogue.
The students were confident their voice would be heard. For in 1987, in a first gradual step towards openness, the party had passed a motion allowing for dialogue between the people and their leaders. On the night of April 19th, thousands of students made their way to party headquarters Zhongnyan High to present their proposals for reforms to Premier Li Peng and demand an official dialogue.
We want to meet with the leaders. We wanted to meet with Li Peng. Oh, and then I think that was the first time I got really beaten by a police in my entire life. When you deploy police, you create the front line. That's what they did.
各位朋友， 往后靠一靠。别挤，别挤，在这个时候，他们出动了近1000名军警，野蛮的冲击我们的队伍，野蛮的殴打我们的学生，还有北京市的其他各界的朋友，打伤人数可以说不计其数，而且他们对我们的女同学进行了猥亵、侮辱。反对镇压，反对暴力，反对暴力。
Being a leader in 1989 really wasn't that hard. I stood up and then people decided to listen. I think that's something people long wanted, not just somebody to take the stage, but to show we're not afraid.
On April 22nd, the state funeral of students' champion Hu Yubong was held in the Great Hall of the People at Tiananmen. With every senior official of the party in attendance, the students saw another opportunity. If the leaders really believed in dialogue, the time had come to put it to the test.
We didn't just come for a funeral. We came to Tiananmen to ask for that dialogue.
And this time, they were determined to be heard.
We have come to the point, we're not going to just beg for democracy. We're going to demand it.
As the students remained steadfast on the square, Zhao Ziyang addressed senior party members. He argued for a policy of persuasion to restore calm. Dialogue was his favored strategy. Premier Li Peng said he agreed, but did he really? The following day, Zhao departed for a diplomatic visit to North Korea, leaving the premier in charge. Behind closed doors, in Deng Xiaoping's home, Li took advantage of Zhao's absence to force Deng's hand on a tougher approach to the student movement.
April 25th, Politburo meeting. Hardliner Premier Li Peng is outraged by the open calls for the government to step down, the appeals to institute broader elections and revise the constitution, to lift restrictions on political parties and newspapers.
For Li Peng to be saying this is like saying this is an existential threat. This is an all or nothing attack on our system and the fact that we, the Communist Party, run the system. Deng apparently listened to Li Peng's argument, listens to the others' comments, and then sums things up by saying,
I completely agree with the Standing Committee's decision. This is no ordinary student movement. A tiny minority want to confuse the people and throw the country into chaos.
This is a well-planned plot whose real aim is to reject the Chinese Communist Party and the socialist system at the most fundamental level. We've got to be explicit and clear in opposing this turmoil.
On the morning of April 26th, the students were confronted with an editorial on the front page of China's official party newspaper, The People's Daily. It claimed the students' actions threatened to plunge the whole country into chaos and sabotage. But sometimes history can turn on just one word. And for Tiananmen, the word was turmoil. It immediately evoked a bloody period in recent Chinese history. Chairman Mao's Cultural Revolution. A grim decade of civil unrest and class war that saw millions jailed and thousands executed. There was no place for scenes like this in Deng's New Deal China.
Il faut bien voir, Deng Xiaoping est un homme qui est obsédé par la révolution culturelle. Rappelons-nous quand même que son fils, son propre fils, Deng Pufang, a été défenestré par les gardes rouges et qu'il est paralysé. Il est en fauteuil roulant. Je veux dire, Deng a été touché dans sa chair. Pour lui, toute manifestation de masse pourrait finir comme la révolution culturelle. Dès qu'il voit de l'agitation, c'est le danger du chaos.
By portraying the peaceful student demonstrators as enemies of the state, Deng's incendiary editorial hit a raw nerve.
26号的《人民日报》这个社论是整个这次89年事件中，我认为最重要的一个事情，就是学生原来情绪比较和缓，但是因为这个社论太激烈，所以学生的情绪也开始变得激烈。
The following day, defying an emergency ban on public protest, the students took their anger to the streets.
北京市政府又在公告中重申了这一规定的法律效能。在这种情况下游行，我们认为这对广大同学是极不负责的，是十分错误的。
21 years old, I was facing this dilemma. Do I give this command for my fellow classmates to go out to face, we don't know what? We told them that we will take part in this march. We will be in the front line.
From universities across the capital, students walked upwards of 3.5 hours to the center of Beijing, outraged by the complete misrepresentation of their movement. They had no idea what the repercussions might be, but there was strength in numbers. There was further strength from a development Deng could never have expected. His editorial had roused the support of the public for the student demonstrations.
We're applauding the people on the office building opposite the street who are supporting them.
The mood throughout the city became ever more jubilant, captured in this never-before-seen amateur footage from the very heart of the demonstration.
Having lived in China for 3 years, I had never seen the Chinese so free to exhibit their sense of freedom in a way. I think there was more awe in the minds of many people that look what we're doing. Look what's happening around us. Look what's happening to our ability to maybe make a protest and have it be successful.
It's one day that I think we will remember in such festive feeling. And everybody was giving us a V sign, and then it became a symbolic gesture of the 1989 student movement too.
C'est une chose qui est absolument inimaginable. Alors que tout le monde a entendu cet éditorial, que tout le monde sait que Deng Xiaoping a dit que s'opposer à l'éditorial serait se ranger du côté des ennemis du régime, tout le monde vient soutenir ces jeunes étudiants et vient les protéger.
Though thousands of police had been mobilized in anticipation of conflict, the march's peaceful good nature caught them off guard. And in the face of overwhelming public support, there was only so much resistance they could use against the now heroic students.
It was such a triumph. We break human walls formed by police. The feared armed police did not arrive. And it was such a carnival.
April 27th, it was successful too. It wasn't just a statement. Winning this campaign is at that time, I feel, a strong probability.
感到非常非常的骄傲，因为这是中国共产党执政1949年以后第一次人民自己上街，所以我想邓小平的内心也是受到的冲击比我内心大得多。他没有想到，我猜了，当然这是我们个人猜测，但是我猜他内心是受到非常大的冲击。
With the belief that triumph was within their grasp, the students realized that to champion democracy, they had to practice what they preached. Back at campuses, they worked swiftly to ballot for elected leaders and formalize their political strategy.
That's when the students decide to set up dialogue delegation because the editorial attacked us as illegal student organizations.
未来跟政府对话，以哪个机构来代表我们去跟政府对话？因为政府现在特别强调合法性问题。
So we asked each campus elect their own dialogue representatives. And making this a very legally formed thing and sending petitions to all government offices demanding dialogue with our representative.
在427游行之后，政府通过新闻媒介表达了愿与学生进行对话的愿望，对此我们表示衷心的欢迎。
上次那个太奇了，可以。
这边没有，没人。你往下，往下，这不接待，这不接待，这是全国人大常委办公室。你往下，不在这儿，在哪儿？不在这儿，不在这儿。你往上，那咱们走到往哪
儿？所以我们没有想到政府就是居然就他自己讲的他也不算。
他说得去南门，我们就是3个人代表40多所高校的学生。
哦，学生代表。
对，就是因为这是全国人大的常委会接待室是吧？
对对对对。
可以接待这个，所以
对对对，
我们就是交到您手里就可以。
对对对。
希望能够尽快遇到。
哪位同志？
我们3个。
哦，那我们呢？
争取啊。这个可以，请看，这是我们的请愿书。
We sit this way.
一边来，一边来，不着急。
他们的请愿书当中提出，我们绝不同意由各高等学校学生会、研究生会组织这样的对话，而且他们要求要在这次游行示威中，经过不合法的手续临时组织起来的所谓高等学校学生自治联合会来组织对话。
There was also the hardening of attitudes among students because the regime sent out for the dialogue some of the most hardline as sort of liars and bastards, kind of thing, to have dialogue with the students and use the old paternalistic, you stupid students, get out of the square kind of thing that absolutely didn't work.
But not everyone in the party took a hard line on the students' demands. Back from his trip to North Korea, staunch reformist Zhao Ziyang was trying to convince his skeptical comrades of the urgent need for political change.
May 1st, reported statement, Politburo Standing Committee meeting. Party Secretary Zhao Ziyang explains the need to accelerate the reform of the political system, especially the building of a socialist democracy based on law. If the party doesn't hold up the banner of democracy, someone else will. Ziyang, however, insists on pursuing multi-channel dialogue while putting pressure on the students to return to classes.
In the Tiananmen student groups, there were some who said, and I think sincerely, we're only trying to help the party be better. All the way over to some would have pulled down the party tomorrow if they could. So within that range of opinion, you have to measure what we mean by Zhao Ziyang was on their side. Zhao Ziyang would not have been in favor of pulling down the party tomorrow. But in terms of the other issues, like getting rid of the unfair corruption, sure, he was on their side.
On May the 4th, a joyful spirit swept through Tiananmen as the people of Beijing celebrated a national holiday. It was the 70th anniversary of a landmark moment when the people's voice had succeeded in changing China's political landscape. For in May 1919, a revolutionary student movement saw 3,000 marching through Beijing. Stirred by China's perceived mistreatment at the hands of the West after World War I, they too had rallied for progress and political freedom. Its leaders went on to become the founders of the Chinese Communist Party. "70 years later, the country was once again on the brink of change. Only this time, it was the Chinese Communist Party itself that had become the target.
There was a lot of pent-up grievances in Chinese society, and people felt finally we can come out and say what we've been trying to say for decades.
但是大家都知道啊，这种权力的这种垄断呢，会造成腐败啊。这个都希望有一个更好的意见表达，能够有一些制度能够反映人们的这种各界不同的这种人们的这种利益要求。
But there was another moment that made May 4th a turning point in an ever-escalating crisis. Zhao Ziyang was scheduled to address an important economic summit, but he made a choice that would later come back to haunt him.
5月4号的时候呢，上午子阳打个电话给我，说赶快来，我就去了。我去了以后，子阳说，下午我要接亚航。他说，我想不讲亚航怎么办？我想讲北京的形势，因为亚航的这些外国投资人都关心中国的投资环境稳定不稳定。他说，你告诉亚洲银行的客人，中国是稳定的。学生并不是反对共产党，学生是希望共产党能够改正自己的错误，应该在民主和法治的轨道上来解决这些问题。这样提出了他的纲领，他叫我赶快写。下午的时候，他就跟这个学生说，
Zhao's position could not have been clearer. The students were reasonable, and China was in no danger of collapsing into the turmoil that Deng Xiaoping had forecast. Shockingly, he had publicly revealed the party's bitter internal split on democratic reform and set himself up for a fall.
People in the conservative faction of the leadership and Deng Xiaoping accused him later of having used this ADB speech to sort of make a public challenge against Deng Xiaoping and the rest of the... But I think his intention, and he defended himself later and said that his intention was simply to continue on the track of signaling to the students that you should separate yourself from the small number of extremists and go back to the campuses, and your message has been heard and accepted.
The students did not go back to campus. On the contrary, the movement had exploded throughout China, a nation now united in its hunger for a different kind of society. Large-scale protests broke out in 21 provinces, the student voice amplified by the support of every sector of the Chinese population. Back at Tiananmen, the movement's driving force had tired of being ignored. What would it take to make the party sit up and listen?
At a meeting, then Wang Dan and a few others came saying, we want to set up a hunger strike.
我们其实没有那么大把握，所以后来当我们绝食的时候，是我们这些人第一批签名要去绝食的，我们不知道有那么多人会跟上。
Everything about the hunger strike would be symbolic, down to the white headbands identifying those taking part. In a country where a friendly way of saying, "How are you?" is, "Have you eaten?" this would be the ultimate sacrifice. After one last meal, the students settled down to occupy Tiananmen Square day and night.
We were going to stop eat to death until our demands were met. We all have written down our last will. It's a moment of self-definition for all the young peoples. We were making who we are.
During the glorious days of our youth, we have no choice but to abandon the beauty of life. Yet how reluctant, how unwilling we are. The country is our country. The people are our people. The government is our government. Who will shout if not us? Who will act if not us? Though our shoulders may be frail, though we are too young to die, we must leave. We have no choice. History demands this of us. Democracy is not the concern of only a few, and the building of democracy cannot be accomplished in a single generation.
This profoundly emotive gesture had an immediate effect. The party was finally ready to talk.
Once the hunger strike started in the early evening, the May 13th, next day, there was an official dialogue with the promise that it would be live broadcasted to the square.
Foreign ministers plus the State Council and the Central Committee of Communist Party were present.
The dialogue team entered the meeting with high hopes. It would be chaired by Yang Mingfu, a true reformist and sympathizer, and the party had agreed it would be broadcast on national television.
And Yang Mingfu sat down and said, as hard as it is for me to agree all this, let me say yes. So yes, we were promised. He tried his very hard to make sure all these conditions were met. Live broadcast, however, was canceled in the last moment.
Wang Changhua barged into the room and said, "We need to stop. There's no broadcast."
So there I got in to say the dialogue must stop. It can't keep on without the hunger strikers agreement, particularly without the live broadcasting.
We feel cheated.
So we were sabotaged by the State Council, by Prime Minister Li Peng, and stopped the broadcast.
从这一天开始，政府是政府，人民是人民，政府从此离开人民了。
As student leaders seethed over the thwarted dialogue, at home, Deng Xiaoping was feeling the heat.
May 13th. Private conversation. Deng Xiaoping affirms to Zhao Ziyang that dialogue is all well and good, but the movement has dragged on for too long. The hunger strike is a ploy to gain international attention. Since USSR Party Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev is due for a crucial state visit in just 2 days' time, Deng is worried about China's international image. The square must be in order when Gorbachev arrives.
Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, which had introduced a fresh openness to Soviet communism, had been an inspiration for the Chinese student movement and throughout the world. But for Deng, Gorbachev's visit came with a fear that it would go down in history as the first step towards glasnost in China. With Deng's panic rising, Zhao's reformist group persuaded a number of Chinese intellectuals to visit Tiananmen, believing that only this respected elite stood a chance of encouraging the students to leave the square.
"而且呢，我当时说嘛，我说我可以去讲几句话，我也讲了，可是我知道是没有用的，因为我们中国句老话，解铃还须系铃人，就是这个学生撤不撤退，只有邓小平说了算。
如果在政府做出让步以后，我们能不能用我们的理性来回答他们呢？我的话完了。
The intellectuals' call for rational thinking fell on deaf ears. Hunger strikers were already fainting. The square had become a charged environment. The following morning, Deng Xiaoping's worst fears were realized. The student movement had proven immovable.
我们当知道这是个机会，就是戈尔巴乔夫来，媒体都来了，所以呢，因为媒体会有报道，所以外界对学生运动会更关注。因为这么多的外国记者在，所以这场运动变得国际化了，变得全世界都知道。
The Chinese leaders will be furious if the historic significance of the summit is overshadowed by internal unrest.
On May 15th, Gorbachev finally landed in China, but he would never make it to Tiananmen. What should have been a glorious state reception on the square became a handshake on the airport runway. There were student demonstrations as far as the eye could see. Deng's humiliation was overwhelming. Standing witness on the rooftop of the Forbidden City, Zhao Ziyang looked down through binoculars on a sea of unwavering protest. 2 days later, it would be his turn to face humiliation.
– May 17th, evening, Politburo meeting. Premier Li Peng lists the massive mistakes of Party Secretary Zhao Ziyang regarding the escalation of the student movement.
Attaquer nommément dans le Parti communiste chinois, c'est quelque chose de très important. Li Peng dit c'est Zhao Ziyang, c'est à cause de lui, c'est lui qui a aggravé la situation.
Li Peng is openly critical. Zhao has exposed the party's internal conflicts. He used Gorbachev's visit to point a spear at Deng Xiaoping while the world was watching.
Et ensuite, on a Deng Xiaoping qui conclut et qui dit aujourd'hui, le seul moyen de résoudre cette situation, c'est de proclamer la loi martiale dans les quartiers urbains de Pékin. Et toi, Zhao Ziyang, en tant que secrétaire général du parti, tu vas mettre cette décision en œuvre.
Quote, "It will be hard for me to carry out this plan. I have difficulties with it, but I will submit to party discipline." Unquote.
赵紫阳他说今天下午，他说常委开了个会，做了个决策。这个决策是什么？我不能告诉你们，因为要保密。这个决策由我来执行是不可能的，由我来执行这个决定呢，要务实的。赶快给我写一封信辞职。
With tensions high in the Forbidden City, Zhao's position was untenable. Without the will to enforce Deng Xiaoping's order, he would have to go.
各位观众，晚上好。现在报告晚间新闻。今天，首都高校部分学生绝食请愿已进入第5天，到今晚为止，绝食的学生达3000人以上，他们的身体已相当虚弱。 到今晚8点为止，已有近2000人次接受救护。学生的绝食请愿活动因此
5 days in, even state-controlled Chinese television was reporting sympathetically on the fasting students.
但是当绝食的时候，突然有一天就是绝食开始的时候，那么开始是几千、几百。 后来就是几十万、上百万的北京市民和学生走上街头，人民的那种力量，而且是，那一刻我感觉到，哇，这是真的是一场，民主运动，而且它是一场，这个，好像我们不能够逆转的，推着我们向前进的一个民主运动啊。
The gravity of the hunger strikers' suffering stirred the emotions of every sector of Beijing society. The students were the people's children, making the ultimate sacrifice for the people. As more and more citizens took to the streets and visited the square in support, a refreshing air of freedom and liberty swept throughout the city.
One gentleman I remember came up next to me and he had his briefcase and his white shirt on, so he was a professional of some kind. And I said, you know, there's a rumor that one of the hunger strikers has died. And he turned to me and he said, this is terrible. This is something that should not happen. And he said, I can handle this. We can handle this.
Okay, right now I'm on the north side of the Great Hall of the People, and this is where 12 Chinese students from the Academy of Drama are holding a hunger strike. However, these 12 are different in that they are not accepting drink or food.
我认为呢，8、9学潮里头有2个点，叫做 a point of no return。哪2个 point of no return 呢？一个就是426社论。邓小平发了这个社论以后，他是不会再退的，他要退就他输了，他犯错误了。第2个 point no return 就是5月13号。 一改为绝食，学生那边也就不能退了。这2个就是体制的和民间各自一方发生的这个不能返回之点。 是最后造成天安门广场血流成河的原因。
Finally, after weeks of resistance, Li Peng agreed to a dialogue with major student leaders, including Wang Dan and Wu Kai-chi. But it was all a sham. The premier knew that martial law was just around the corner. The students were weak with hunger, but determined to put up a spirited fight.
作为一个政府的总理，作为一个共产党员，不隐瞒自己的观点，但是我今天不讲。如果我们今天一味要在这个问题上纠缠，我认为是不合适的，是不理智的。
但是好像有些领导同志还没有明白，那么我愿意再重复一遍：现在解决问题的关键，并不是说服我们在座的这些人。
The students were sort of puffed up, I think, with the power of being covered by the international media, of having somehow gotten away with this demonstration for weeks and weeks, and they were like, "We're winning. You listen to us."
问题在于怎么去让他们离开，他们离开的条件。
Until today, I think I was quite polite. I was firm, and then I think I was a little agitated, but of course, I was in my 5th days of hunger strike.
我已经说得很清楚了，刚才他们离开这里的条件我已经说得很清楚了，只有这一种可能性，这是客观现实、客观事实。我们如果广场上有一个人不离开，还在继续绝食的话，我们就很难保证剩下的几千人不离开。
But unfortunately, that meeting wasn't meant for them to listen. They didn't bring their heirs. They were there to just talk.
In the dawn hours of May 19th, Zhao Ziyang made a final visit to Tiananmen. He came with an apology to the students, but hidden within was a suggestion that perhaps their time was up.
我当时陪我爸爸正在我们家看电视啊，看到赵紫阳说这段话时，我爸爸就拍着他的腿说呀：“完了完了完了完了！”
绝食的同学，每隔2小时务必要进1次水。以上是在这种情况下，为保护受限。
我想运动一开始我是没有什么害怕的，就是我目标是很清楚的。那但是运动发展成绝食，然后变成全民的民主运动之后，尤其赵紫阳就是已经下台以后，坦率讲，我开始慢慢的会有一些害怕。我这个害怕当然不是怕我个人的处境，是不是会被捕啊，会不会开除学籍，那个我还没有，因为那个感到害怕。我会有一点点害怕，是因为我不知道这个事情会怎么结束。
11:46 p.m. and there are rumors that there are armed forces, soldiers to the south of the city.
With Zhao Ziyang's ruthless dismissal, the party had shown they would stop at nothing to put a lid on the movement. And for those in the square, it was becoming clear that some kind of showdown was now inevitable.
鉴于北京市已经发生了严重的动乱，破坏了社会安定，国务院决定，自1989年5月20日10时起，在北京市部分地区实行戒严。
The rumors spreading through Tiananmen became stark reality when, on the evening of May 19th, Premier Li Peng revealed to the party the emergency plan for suppressing the students.
策划和煽动动乱的极少数人，他们打错了算盘，以为党和政府软弱可欺，不得不采取果断的、坚决的措施来制止这一场动乱。广大的革命的先烈用鲜血创造出来的中华人民共和国，都面临着严重的威胁。
A chaos had broken out in the city, according to the leadership, and martial law was required. Everyone had to leave the square immediately or be responsible for the consequences. The troops were on their way.
At midnight, Li Peng's declaration was broadcast to the masses in Tiananmen Square. In a matter of hours, every one of them would be subject to military rule. Demonstrations, mass gatherings, speeches, everything that fueled their movement would become criminal activity.
肯定是，就是因为跟政府宣布戒严，就等于把我们当做就是一定要去法律去惩罚的对象，所以那个冲击当然就是非常大。
More than 200,000 soldiers of the People's Liberation Army had been deployed, primed to seize control of 7 major Beijing districts for as long as the repression would take.
An astonishing thing happened that night. Everyone was keeping vigil in the square, waiting for the soldiers to arrive. The hours ticked by, and then about 3 a.m., people were thinking, where's the army? You know, what's holding it?
The party's stated aim for martial law was to curb the turmoil with a firm hand. But they hadn't taken into account the unique relationship between Chinese citizens and their army. In a country where school children are taught to sing "The Army Loves the People," this firm hand was a personal affront.
I just climbed off the trucks and talked to them and said, do you know what's been going on? And why are you doing this? You know, we're on the same side. We just want China to be better.
Suddenly, the student loudspeakers came to life in the square and announced, the great citizenry of Beijing has stopped the advance of the PLA into the capital at all points of entry by sheer force of numbers.
Les ouvriers, les travailleurs, les ménagères, tout le monde arrive en disant « Vous ne pouvez pas entrer dans Pékin, ce sont nos enfants, vous avez été mal informés, ce n'est pas possible, arrêtez-vous ici, vous ne savez pas ce qui se passe. » Et comme toujours en Chine, qu'est-ce qu'on fait? On apporte à manger aux soldats. Et si on apporte à manger aux soldats, ça veut dire qu'on est en pleine fraternité et donc on ne tire pas sur des gens qui vous apportent à manger.
On the morning of May 20th, military helicopters circled Tiananmen, dropping bulletins detailing the strict regulations of martial law. Though the troops had been stalled, the new order was here to stay.
奉命执行北京市部分地区戒严任务的部队要认真履行自己的职责，各有关方面和人民群众要积极配合，尽力支援。
But, emboldened and victorious, the students would not be intimidated. The hunger strike would be abandoned in favor of permanent occupation of the square. The standoff between the people and the party had reached a whole new level.
那就是说，我们不仅是对立了，而且是敌人了。
So far, emergency measures had failed to hold back the tidal wave of protest. Not only were Beijing citizens stalling the military crackdown, martial law was under threat from within. An unprecedented mutiny within every rank of the People's Army itself.
There are accounts of soldiers that didn't want to be doing what they were doing. The real tough question is how widespread was that kind of thinking?
As chairman of the Central Military Commission, Deng's orders should have been final. Instead, he was now under fire as his plan looked perilously close to backfiring.
The army was deeply divided. We also know that the commander of the 38th Army, which is the Beijing division, Beijing-based division of the PLA, refused to carry out orders.
May 21st, meeting with the elders, home of Deng Xiaoping, Forbidden City. Deng Xiaoping called for an emergency meeting with the 8 elders. He states that martial law hasn't restored order. The ongoing divisions inside the party prevent from taking action against an issue that should have been solved long ago. Party and state are facing a life and death crisis. Deng incites the elders to publicly support the army and martial law.
On May 22nd, Deng raised the stakes. All hopes of crushing the student movement lay with martial law, and he had to retake command immediately. First off, any dissenters within the party itself must be curbed. Reformists must be kept at bay. He ordered that his own comrades be put under surveillance.
所有的政府机构，部啊、国务院呐，也被军队接管了。就是部长不能够去办公室，不能够离开家，将军啊，什么东西啊，军队负责人、高级夫人全部不能离开家，被看守在。权力呢，就转移到了戒严指挥部。所以它真正的是一个政变。
A transfer of power that had no actual constitutional legitimacy. But by now, Deng had assumed absolute control.
而邓小平当时只是什么都不是，对不对？他就是个军委主席，他连政治局里的任何职务都没有，当然就是一场政变。
Desperate measures were needed, for outrage at martial law had once again united the Chinese people against the government. A protest in Hong Kong, where 600,000 took to the streets, mirrored similar mass gatherings throughout China, from Wuhan to Shanghai to Chongqing and beyond.
Alors rappelons-le encore, il faut obtenir la solution dans l'ensemble du pays. Le pouvoir se dit que si on y met un terme à Pékin, ça arrêtera dans le reste des provinces, mais la loi martiale qui est proclamée à Pékin pourrait ne pas résoudre l'ensemble des problèmes.
To buy himself time to enlist the support of China's entire military force, Deng temporarily withdrew the troops to the outskirts of Beijing. But as one massed convoy left the city, a whole new group of protesters was just arriving. On May 23rd, a staggering 1 million Beijing workers staged a mass strike in support of the student call for democracy.
This was really quite something. Big column of brawny workers appeared in the square carrying banners and looking very kind of proletarian. The big banners saying, 市民敢死队, which means citizens dare to die brigades. The message the workers were giving at this time is, we, the workers, are here, and we will defend the students in this square with our lives, if necessary. And as soon as the workers actively came in on their own account, then it became a multi-class movement, which was really unprecedented in China.
Nurses, journalists, even the police, openly identifying themselves with the movement. The closest thing to a quasi-revolution Beijing's streets had yet seen.
Et là, c'est quelque chose qui dépasse complètement ce que le Parti communiste a cherché à faire depuis sa prise de pouvoir, c'est-à-dire cloisonner la société en cellules qui communiquent très peu entre elles au niveau horizontal.
This further fueled the government's paranoia. In fact, this really was their worst nightmare.
给套，驻扎队的。他能抓警察。
我的泪水已不再是哭泣，我的微笑已不再是演戏。你的自由是属于天和地。
Workers, citizens, students together. Tiananmen Square had become the triumph of the people. No longer just the headquarters of a movement, but the epicenter of a classless, free-speaking Chinese people, a self-run civil society, and a model of the China they all hoped one day to live in.
It's very hard in Beijing to find ordinary people who were on the government side. People came out, and the public mood was better than I'd ever seen it in Beijing. People were nice to each other. There were no policemen, but it was a self-run city, very civilized.
The crime rate was down during that time, and it was a funny moment that there was little posters saying that thieves in Beijing declared a strike. They will stop stealing in support of the student.
To us, it was China's Woodstock. It was the first opportunity for people since 1949 to fully express themselves.
而这个民主运动让你感觉到，当中国人获得了一点点自由和民主的时候，他们有能力毫无暴力的达到自己的这个生活乐趣，没有跟政府造成任何的伤害。
But in the cold light of day, many woke up to the harsh realities at play in this utopian city within a city. Day-to-day organization and logistics on the square were tough. With martial law still very much in operation, each day was an anxious waiting game. Fatigue and anxiety meant emotions could turn on a dime. And the movement's democratic principles were slipping away as hot-headed sentiment gradually replaced reason.
我再要说一句，最后一句就是：历史后自然前进，绝不能倒退。
And the radical voices are usually louder. The rational voices can hardly compete with those voices. So it's clear toward the end of the May, there were different voices in Tiananmen Square.
Maybe we will lose our lives. We will lose our lives. But we have decided we must go on. We must strike on.
As many assumed the mantle of resistance fighters, clenched fists replaced the more peaceful victory sign of yore. Key to the square's mounting radicalization was its newly installed commander-in-chief, 23-year-old Chai Ling.
So basically, two choices every evening under the in-square meeting. Are we withdrawing or are we staying? So people then vote we are staying. So always more people voted for staying. There was no real discussion, real debate about political possibilities and long-term considerations, nothing long-term.
For a political movement, a campaign in such a huge scale, to reach its desired consequences, desired result, we need to be able to not just charge our emotion, but also be able to restrain from it.
By the middle of May, the movement hit a new turning point that would prove critical in the weeks to follow. As many of the first wave vacated the square, a constant flow of new students from the Chinese provinces was pouring into Beijing on a daily basis, drawn by the hope of being a founding part of China's glorious future. But were they perhaps too naive to see the danger that lay ahead?
A lot of the Beijing students did leave, and they were replaced in the square by students who came from other cities. So they're arriving, and somebody says, oh, it's time to fold up and go back. No, we just got here. The ones who stayed to the very end and risked their lives, and some of them lost their lives, were disproportionately students from outside of Beijing.
If we vacate the square before June 4th, we probably could avoid a bloodshed. I'm not saying students should hold responsibility for the bloodshed. If we could have avoided it, and then we didn't, I think that's the question will haunt us for the rest of our lives.
On May 27th, the longest-serving student leaders addressed a packed crowd in what would be a last-chance gathering on the square. They were faced with a moral dilemma. Should they lead to the bitter end, or anticipate an inevitable catastrophe and encourage the students to back down?
我们都不希望暴力的发生，但是我们这些可以说70后的这一批人，是对共产党历史上这种杀人这种没有经历过，所以说对他还抱有很多的这种幻想。 但是6·4枪响之后，我们才明白啊。
But Wu Kai-chi and Wang Dan had the benefit of first-hand experience of dealing with the party, and both knew how cold and ruthless it could be. They foresaw a tragic conclusion and, unable to convince their fellow students otherwise, withdrew from Tiananmen.
One of the features of tragedy probably is that the inevitability is exclusively retrospective. The inevitability is not there in the doing. There are so many off-ramps that are not taken, and that becomes the tragedy.
By May 27th, Deng's military strategy went into overdrive. The end was in sight. He'd secured the backing of every army governor and enlisted an onslaught of troops from provinces throughout China to carry out a final, no-holds-barred act of suppression. This time, there would be no mutiny from any direction.
所以我专门研究有一个结果，就是邓小平这些中共领导人为什么要调这么多的部队，调4大军的部队，就是要防止中共党内的一种政变。
On their arrival in Beijing, the outsider troops were confined to suburban military camps and systematically groomed to crush the movement once and for all.
这些戒严部队官兵单方面的接受中国官方，包括戒严部队指挥部给他提供的虚假的信息，包括就是说很多北京暴徒在各个地方杀害你们的战友，抢劫你们的武器。
The soldiers were mostly young peasant males who came into the army and now were sent to the city. They were indoctrinated. They were told that this was a counter-revolutionary riot inspired by foreign forces and that it was their patriotic duty to follow instructions.
June 1st. Propaganda report ordered by Li Peng. The turmoil was planned, organized, and premeditated by a tiny minority of people. Hostile forces, organizations, individuals from inside or from abroad have provided spiritual and material aid to the plotters. They are determined to push for a final showdown with the party and government. They pulled together thugs like the motorcycled Flying Tiger Group, Dare to Die Brigade, and the Army of Volunteers. Plans were made to kidnap or detain party and state leaders.
By June 2nd, a massive statue dominated the square, created by students of the Fine Arts Academy. Modeled on the Statue of Liberty and dubbed the Goddess of Democracy, it had been erected in a confrontational face-off with the portrait of Chairman Mao. For a dying movement, it was one last defiant gesture, if ultimately futile. During the day, 4 celebrated intellectuals, led by Liu Xiaobo and Chinese pop superstar Hu Dejian, launched an emergency hunger strike. Its aim? To forge solidarity with the students and make a final plea for calm and a peaceful return to their campuses. But it was all in vain.
完全看到知道出路在哪里，可以避免流血的出路在哪里，但是你就做不到。 那种绝望，那真的是。
June 2nd, evening, Politburo meeting. Members of the Politburo urged Deng Xiaoping to take firm action. The army needs to intervene now.
Une décision grave va être prise. Depuis 15 jours, les troupes de la loi martiale sont bloquées aux portes de la ville. Il faut faire quelque chose.
Deng Xiaoping agrees with the committee. Martial law troops should begin to carry out the clearing plan and finish it within 2 days.
Et chacun des anciens répète, effectivement, il faut maintenant nettoyer la place, nous sommes d'accord.
Reformist Qiao Shi admits that clearing the square is necessary. Unfortunately, events have shown that students had not left the square spontaneously.
Qiao Shi, un proche de Fuyao, donne aussi son aval, il est d'accord avec les autres, on peut procéder au massacre tranquillement, car au fond, ce qu'on craignait le plus, c'était l'éclatement du parti. Là, le parti est uni derrière cette décision, tout le monde est mouillé.
In the early morning hours of June 3rd, the People's Liberation Army headed for the square. Tiananmen was on course to becoming a war zone. Deng's strategic clearing operation had begun. But after 7 weeks of hope and resistance, the people of Beijing were not going to go down easily.
所以到2号，我们就开始感到气氛紧张。2号晚上的一天，这里那里都抓到军人，他们是便衣、白衬衣、绿军裤子、短头，一个大轿车，在里面发现了冲锋枪 K-47，我就上去。 然后和几个学生说要把它守住，不能要人抢。
It was a weird atmosphere, and I can remember our young driver. He reached down and he picked up a knife. He had this long knife. He said, "I'm going down to the square to help the students."
As morning broke, undercover soldiers continued to infiltrate the city, intercepted and disarmed at every stage. The military strategy was still unclear to the students. Were these weapons simply for intimidation, or unthinkably, would live ammunition eventually be loaded?
中国官方想通过地面的行动引起军民的冲突，然后就说北京有动乱。
On Tiananmen Square, a platoon of troops was dispatched from the Great Hall of the People in order to take control and seize back their stolen weaponry. The wave was starting to break. The first sign of real conflict and of the bloodshed that was now all but inevitable. The party's determination was becoming clear. Nothing must stop this final crackdown.
June 3rd, 5 p.m. Orders from the Politburo to the Central Military Commission. At 9 p.m. on June 3rd, People's Liberation Army, People's Armed Police, assisted by Beijing Public Security, will begin to put down the riot that has erupted in the capital. Martial law troops will arrive at the square at 1 a.m. on June 4th and clear it by 6 a.m. They must resolutely carry out their mission according to the schedule. Absolutely no delays will be permitted. No one is permitted to block the advance of the troops. If blocking occurs, soldiers may clear it using all self-defense means that may be required. Television will broadcast non-stop emergency announcements from the Beijing Municipal Government and the Martial Law Command. Important announcements will also be broadcast over loudspeakers in the square.
The message was blunt. If killing was required, then so be it.
L'armée n'est pas équipée de balles en caoutchouc, il n'y a pas de matraques, il n'y a que des AK-47 et des tanks. Donc là, ça prouve clairement qu'il est question de faire un exemple.
The party's official announcement had lit up the city. All along Chang'an Avenue, the main artery to Tiananmen, outraged citizens started building barricades and setting the boulevard ablaze. As with the announcement of martial law, they were hell-bent on holding back the army at all costs. But this time, for some, it would come at a price.
所以3号晚上，我就跟朋友告别了，骑着自行车就去了长安街。那时候有一个感觉，好像觉得这就去了不会回来了，就走向死亡。
方法，为了把它写给他们把这个评了吧。今天我跟你说天安门广场。
然后我们再往前走，有一个人在那里浑身是血，在那里讲说他们开枪了，开枪了。所有的人都哭。
News of the crackdown had brought more and more citizens out to the streets, and they crowded out every intersection around the square. But they were the first to discover the brutal truth behind Deng Xiaoping's plan. The ammunition was real, and the death toll had begun.
Tiananmen Square was ground zero for the troops that were converging from all points of the compass. But the scene of the massacre was on the approach roads coming into the city. The people who came out to block them were the citizens because they were trying to protect their students. I think it's no exaggeration to say that the Beijing citizens fell in love with those students, that they just could not bear the thought that these students were going to be violently rounded up or even killed.
特别是每一个十字路口，都有市民在那里扔石块想挡住他们，他们就开枪，我们就看到那十字路口的市民就把受伤的人、打死的人就拖走。
I was not thinking. I couldn't. I just experienced, without any mental psychological preparation, the most horrifying thing in my life. I just saw a female student from another university we took a bullet on her face, which to this day I believe that bullet was meant for me. And then she was carried by 4 people and passed in front of me. And I looked down, I saw her face.
By the end of the night, the mood on Tiananmen Square remained defiant, thousands of students still waving the victory sign. News of the shooting hadn't yet arrived, and the diehards were still camped out at the symbolically named Monument to the People's Heroes.
但我还是在士兵以前，我比士兵先到了广场。我终于到了墓地，到了广场，就有人就带我到了那个广播站。我就跟广播站的人，我说教室前边是杀人。 已经有很多人死了，只开枪。
纪念碑同学，大家不要慌，就算军队进来，还有一个过程，我们自己不要把自己给搞乱了，我们绝不后退半步。
我就说，你们不撤，我理解，但是我求你们一件事，我是军队来了，你们千万不要反抗，千万不要反抗。 石头都不要扔。
But the atmosphere in Tiananmen had instantly turned, chaotic and violent. When a lone army tank appeared, it was blasted by petrol bombs. That was nothing compared to what would follow. ，Loudspeakers boomed out all over the square, projecting a thinly veiled threat of imminent repression. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. The massed ranks of the army had finally broken through.
直接就是开枪， 失踪的一些学生，也是纠察队外地来的纠察队的人，因为开枪先是向他们射击他们要保护军人，还要保护市民。
With every point of entry and exit to Tiananmen now completely blocked, the students had been hemmed into a standoff. Those who had vowed to maintain the occupation to the bitter end were confronted with an all too familiar dilemma: to stay or leave. Except that this time people had already died. And who might be next?
Suddenly, a group of about 10 PLA soldiers formed a line and started marching south. They suddenly stopped, lowered their rifles and began firing. The experience of being fired at by 10 soldiers with AK-47s is unforgettable.
有一辆这个打坏的一个吉普车上有3位，就是学生啊，躺在那儿。我一看，这个血都已经流到那个车上很多。哎呀，这个时候我就感觉到，怎么会发生这种事情呢？所以说那一刻我是觉得最危险的。
I went towards the stairs, the front stairs of Great Hall of People. I saw hundreds and hundreds of troopers dashed out with automatic guns with bayonets on them, and they were wearing helmets. They were emerging from like a hole on the ground, a secret entrance or exit below the stairs, literally from under the ground.
当那个军官距离我10米的时候用5.4的手枪向我射击，我被打倒的时候，我当时一点不痛，我的腿就是很胀很胀他们一抬我的时候，这个骨头就错开了。当时那种疼痛真的是无法形容的。那一刻我就知道，原来这是一颗真的子弹，那个不是橡皮子弹
4点钟，就是整个广场的灯光全部熄灭了，所以那也是天安门广场最恐怖的时候。所以过了半个小时，就到了清晨4点30分钟的时候灯亮，我们就突然发现，就是说坦克进来了。
That noise of the tanks roaring in, still so far, was the loudest noise I've ever heard in my life. Still, that noise stays with me forever.
旁边就我同学的，就我中学同学，他就在这里，坦克压死人，坦克压死人。我就看对面，就是坦克从一堆尸体下面退下来。其中我就说，我写过，我就忘不了的那个。一个穿那个蓝裙子他就坦克下面，
The Beijing United Medical College had a medical emergency tent in the northern sector of the square. I will never forget the scene there. It was so moving. One young man had taken a bullet to the side of the head. He was clearly dying. I mean, blood pouring out of his head. And the doctor said to me, you know, we can't really do anything except try to make these people comfortable, these casualties, because we have no plasma, we have no drugs. The troops are not allowing us to take casualties out of the square to the hospitals. That's a war crime, right off.
In one last-ditch attempt to avoid further carnage, 2 of the emergency hunger strikers still on the square set off to negotiate a truce with the military.
They said, look, give us more time, we will try to clear the square. We don't want violence. And the officer in charge of the troops in the square said, you have limited time, but if you can do this, you will deserve merit.
But by the time the mobile units of the 27th Army had arrived on the Monument of the People, there was no doubting that the party had been the victor.
你想，我就坐在那个台阶上，就觉得说，在这个钢铁庞然大物坦克面前，我们作为一个肉身、一个人体，真的微不足道。我身后的一个军官是一个上尉。 所以他一手拿着手枪，一手拿着话筒，就是要让学生赶快撤。所以他就是很清楚地跟我说，就是说你们赶快撤，不撤的话，我们必须得执行清场命令，可能会流血。
After days of waiting and hoping, there was no choice left. Stay and die, or leave and be defeated. For one final time, it was put to the vote. And for the first time, the result was leave.
I felt the ultimate total helplessness. Human bodies against state apparatus, dictatorship machines, the cold steel.
Could you tell us what happened?
There was a TV crew. And I remember that moment when the light was on me. My immediate thought was that I know how dangerous it is to say something on camera, obviously a foreign crew, but it's very important to tell the world they're killing people.
Do you think anybody got killed?
Of course, I'm sure, very sure. Many students were killed. It is said 1,000 students.
How do you feel right now?
Feel right now? I'm very angry.
You had agreed to leave the square?
We're just forced to do that.
What they are doing now is just opposite to the people's willing.
On June 4th, Beijing citizens woke to scenes of pure devastation. The streets were unrecognizable. A city in ruins, paralyzed with shock.
Ce qui restera, c'est que l'armée de libération populaire a tiré sur une foule sans armes qui était restée non violente pendant une occupation qui a duré pendant 1 mois et demi. au fond, qu'il y ait eu 1000, 2000 ou 3000 morts, importe peu. La décision même de tirer sur une foule désarmée est une responsabilité à laquelle ne pourra jamais échapper Deng Xiaoping.
I learned later on from a close personal friend who also has been close to the Deng family. Even when they surrounded Tiananmen Square and started shooting, the whole family was on the edges of their seats, getting all this live report. The moment they took over and the students were forced to peacefully withdraw from the square, and they all let out a sigh. This is Deng's family. And they went to sleep.
On June 5th, in the wake of a savage suppression that had devastated Beijing, no one expected there would be one defiant last stand. But what a stand it was.
Of course, everyone's seen the picture of the man who stood in front of the tanks. This man looked about sort of in his 30s. Imagine the audacity and bravery of this man. This one man has brought the PLA to a halt.
It's climbing it. Climbing on.
But we never hear about him again after that. He is an enigma, but at the same time, he epitomizes the whole movement. He represents tens or hundreds of thousands of Beijing citizens and citizens from cities all around the country who came out to say no and tried to stop this military rape of their city by the army.
The clampdown on Tiananmen did not just end with the clearing of the square. Tens of thousands of arrests were made. Others, some of them workers labeled as rioters, were executed. And despite the party's recourse to military brutality, Deng continued to put his spin on the truth behind the massacre.
今天，北京市中级人民法院公开判处一批在北京发生的反革命暴乱期间进行打砸抢烧的严重刑事犯罪分子。
He had suppressed a counter-revolutionary riot and restored stability to the nation while denying the human cost.
解放军的军车也没有压死过一个人。 现在世界舆论当中有所谓血洗天安门死了多少人的这种舆论是不正确的。
For Deng Xiaoping, this case was now closed. The events of the previous 7 weeks had been just a blip in the success of his New Deal for China.
My feeling, I'm pretty confident of this, of why he chose a massacre was to slam the lid on once and for all. And it worked. It intimidated not only people in Beijing, but people all over the country. And you can argue that the intimidation has lasted until today.
"30 years on, there is no memorial to the events of 1989 in Tiananmen Square. Will there ever be? Though China is now a great power of the 21st century, the Communist Party still rules with an iron fist. All memory of the tragedy of Tiananmen has been suppressed, and the party will stop at nothing to keep it that way."
所有这些威权的集权国家啊，都是要尽可能的抹杀真实的历史的。这个从来如此。这个30年来不断的在抹杀，在掩盖89真实的历史。许多年轻人不知道啊，许多家长呢，出于一些安全上的考虑，怕自己的孩子受有出问题，也不讲。
还保留着6四记忆的人，他们都活着，只是我们有没有机会去把他们召唤过来。 你们想一想，20多天你会见到中国人脸上都带着笑脸，他们都是受害者，他们都受了伤害，他们都消失了，他们都变了。那么这个比大屠杀，我认为这是在精神上的一种伤害，还是更加可怕的，因为我亲自经历过。
For 30 years, I wrote about Tiananmen and my personal experience. It's a form of therapy, and it's still very emotionally charged for me. I can move on and live relatively a normal life. But my fellow students and my fellow countrymen and China did not have that chance.
In the wake of the Tiananmen crackdown, 21 of its key players were condemned as China's most wanted criminals. Number 1 was Wang Dan, who spent 5 years in prison before being freed. 7 others, including Wu Kai-chi, Chai Ling, and Wang Chaohua, fled to avoid arrest and now live in permanent exile. They will have no second chance at changing the course of China's history.
We achieved so much by the end of May. We have changed the political landscape of China. So much achievement to give away within a debate of whether staying or leaving the square. Of course, it's very frustrating. We made a demand. The government did not respond. And then the crowd, the people decide to stay applying that pressure and willing to pay the price for that is their glorious decision.
我只是说，如果历史可以重来一回，我们会做得更好。我不认为我们参加这场运动，为此付出这么大牺牲，会后悔。我觉得这件事对我来说是很荣耀的一件事情。
On the more specific tactics, strategies, analysis, there were endless regrets. But on the whole, no. I'm very proud I was part of it.